And we also need to avoid simply telling dozens of countries, you need to contract sharply your public investment and your social spending and so forth.
So you effectively
Because
coming full circle from what, being the sort of from professing shock therapies, you are coming full circle into actually going against these sort of fiscal cuts in the country.
no. Remember, when I was advocating shock therapy, I was advocating that governments not print money or issue money in order to finance budget deficits. But I was constantly recommending that the international finance help the countries to avoid defaults or crises. One of the key pillars of shock therapy in Bolivia and Poland, for example, was a cancellation of the debts of those countries, the foreign debts. So I argued that to pay the foreign debts in Bolivia would have condemned the country to a rampant hyperinflation. And in the end, Bolivia's external debt to international banks was cut by about 90% at my recommendation. Similarly, in Poland, in that shock therapy, I recommended that Poland's debt overhang should be relieved. The debt that Poland owed, especially to its official creditors, should be cut very, very sharply, and that indeed happened. So I did not recommend simply austerity and contraction. I recommended always that the international counterparts, the creditors, play a role, a constructive role, a positive role in preventing crisis in the debtor countries.
And in debt relief, regardless the potential risk of moral hazard
debt relief depends on the circumstances. In the circumstances today, I'm not recommending cancellation of the face value of debts. What I am recommending is that one way or another, and it depends very much on the specific circumstances, that countries get the kinds of development finance that they need, even on a larger scale than now. And I'm talking about new debts on a long-term, low-interest rate basis so that these countries can continue to develop without going into default today. It's a tricky proposition for countries that have borrowed on the Eurobond market, governments that owe money right now. It may be that they have to say to the creditors, well, we need to extend the horizon for repayment under certain kinds of contracts where there are collective action clauses. This can be done fairly smoothly, and probably many countries are going to have to take that chance. When it comes to official credits that a government owes to a rich country government or to the World Bank or to some other international institution, I'm recommending a set of measures to make sure that the developing countries are getting more finance in fresh form than they are repaying on old debts. There are many ways to do that, but I'm basically saying don't print money. I've never believed in that because you just get high inflation, but rather let's get a financial solution that doesn't condemn the country to default or to bankruptcy or to extreme austerity. That's actually always been my policy recommendation since I started this approach in Bolivia in 1985.
And is it achievable under the current circumstances when the US Fed is fighting a 40-year high inflation and has been pushing up interest rates higher to the unprecedented high for, let's say, several decades going back, because that's actually been increasing the debt load or debt gearing of and servicing costs, debt servicing costs for all the EMs or developing countries?
It's going to be a close call for several reasons, but let me put it this way. Currently, the 30-year bond rate of the U.S. Treasury is about 3.2%, still quite low. the 30-year bond rate for German debt is still around 1%, actually. The 30-year bond rate for Ghana or for an emerging economy, if they can get a 30-year loan, is 10%. In other words, I am advocating a significant increase of official financing at interest rates that the Treasury or the German government or other Eurozone countries pay themselves. The real room for maneuver is that the interest rates paid by the high-income countries are still very low compared to what the emerging market economies face. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is a major expansion of funds coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that essentially can borrow on terms very close to what the US government or German government or Japanese government can borrow at, and therefore lend at quite low and long-term interest rates to emerging markets that, if they are left on their own, face horrendous terms that would drive them into default.
And then we are back into the whole idea of like the currently lack of cooperation will on the global level. We have to get back.
There you go. So I'm recommending to the G20 this approach. But is there a G20 even right now? Countries are barely talking to each other. The US and Russia literally are not talking to each other, of course. US and China barely talking to each other and cooperating on something as bold as avoiding a financial crisis. Somehow it's not going well. And for me, all through my career, even when I didn't understand it properly at the time, it has been determined by geopolitics. Will something work or won't it work? Because you need cooperation. If the cooperative environment is there, a lot can get done. If there is no cooperation, the chance for a contagion is very, very real. This, I think, is what we face right now.
I have a last question on this topic. The ECB is facing a real difficult times and dilemma. Even, I mean, it's behind the tightening curve, launched by the Fed earlier in the season. What can ECB do to actually, put its policies back straight on the right course of sustaining that kind of development and preventing any global financial crisis, or maybe world financial crisis number 2 following 2008, 2009?
Well, I think Europe is in an extremely difficult situation, not mainly because of the ECB, but mainly because of the war in Ukraine and the vulnerability on energy, obviously. Europe's already in a downturn. It could get quite severe in the coming months. My position on this is not popular in Europe among the politicians, but as I've emphasized, my position is that there is a negotiated way out of this. I don't believe the NATO line that, well, we're just going to fight till we defeat Putin. If that is the approach, I don't think it's going to succeed on the battlefield. And I also think that the consequences economically will become quite unmanageable. The crisis will be very serious in my view. Now, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I believe that the energy crisis and all of the uncertainties around it and all of the other ramifications, and you compound that with the growing break with China as well, I think will lead to a very significant crisis in Europe. And since we see the politics are already quite unstable in a number of countries, including Italy, for example, where the Draghi government has just fallen, and who knows what will happen next with elections coming up, I think that the chance of revisiting a deep Eurozone crisis becomes very real. So I don't see the pieces working very well right now. And the ECB can only do so much in this context. I think it's going to have an extremely difficult time unless we find a way to peace and to easing the very, very high tensions right now.
You are viewed, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the co-author or co-father of the United Nations development goals that are used in the currently, often discussed ESG policies. And you are the Columbia University director of the Center for Sustainable Development. And what does it mean? What is your typical day like in this role?
Great question. Typically, it's Zooming from early morning till late at night, because now in our digital world, we can meet and speak all over the world rather conveniently.
And do it sustainably.
And do it depending on how exactly the electricity is provided for our Zooms. That remains a question, but it's much more sustainable than getting on an airplane for every meeting that one has to have. I spend a tremendous amount of my day, every day, working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. I believe, as I've been emphasizing, that global cooperation is necessary, is vital, and is feasible. I don't believe in a divided world. I don't believe in democracies versus autocracies. I don't believe in cold wars or hot wars. I believe that our environmental and social crises are so severe that we need cooperation right now above all of the differences that we might suppose to divide the world. And so I speak with the Chinese, I speak with Latin America, African leaders, European leaders, all the time. And I promote solutions, as we discussed, for the financial crisis, which is deepening, for the climate crisis, which is deepening. And I help to lead a network of more than 1,500 universities around the world to address, through education and research and policy analysis, how to promote sustainable development. And war is my enemy, obviously, because it's the biggest distraction. It sucks up all the energy. It destroys so much faster than we can possibly build. It undermines every opportunity for trust and partnership. So these days I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to see, is there some way to overcome this two-front crisis that we face with Russia and China against the U.S. And its alliance. And I always appeal for Europe to be smarter in its diplomacy, because Europe has the values of sustainable development, yet it's caught in war. And I want to see Europe get out of this trap of war, not fall into a trap of a new battle with China, and help lead the way to a cooperative approach to sustainable development.
How do you see the latest efforts by US and EU authorities in sort of codifying the ESG rules? How do you see the current approach to that? Whether it should be sort of more better codified from the above rather than sort of driven from below by the markets?
It definitely, we need top-down codification and top-down policies. And very broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is a valid, smart, I would say sophisticated approach. It's got many limitations. But the European Green Deal is a framework that the 27 have adopted. It can serve as a roadmap. It's not exactly a plan, of course, and there are 1,000 details to be argued every day. Is natural gas really green? Is nuclear green? And so on. So these are inevitable points of debate. But broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is well done and well worth achieving and well worth promoting diplomatically to say to the Latin American countries, to the African Union, to ASEAN, and so on, you need a Green Deal the same way we have a Green Deal. Europe could really provide a lot of leadership that way.
When it comes to the Green Deal taxonomy, what's really important for the Czech Republic and even some other Central European countries, do you think that the nuclear power should be viewed as sustainable going forward? And that Germany should actually bring its, sort of reverse its policy of shutting down nuclear power plants?
I think nuclear power, if, and this is a big if it can be managed safely so that with the absolute state-of-the-art safety systems, especially passive safety systems, offers a component of the zero carbon energy system. I don't believe, I'm not myself a purist that says absolutely no to nuclear power. Of course, it raises many issues, fissile materials, nuclear safety, nuclear waste, and the alternatives, because if you could do it without nuclear through an efficient system of wind, solar, hydro, and so forth, there's a lot of merit to that. But I think within the practical context, there's no doubt that nuclear power is going to continue to play its role, obviously in France, obviously in Central Europe, obviously in China, in Korea, in
Ukraine,
a lot of
in
countries
Russia.
in the world. Well, in Russia and Ukraine, I would expect so also, absolutely.
The crisis is biggest. There are gaps in the high-income countries, but I don't worry too much about them because those are political obstacles that should be filled, but it's manageable. Upper middle income is tricky because some upper middle income countries have good access to credit, others don't have access to credit. Then there's another consideration. Sorry, and I'll come to a conclusion. Technically, what do? There are two related issues. One, how could you make capital flow at relatively low cost and long-term maturity to poorer countries? This is the major technical question on finance. If you look at the penalties that low-income countries pay to borrow, they're quite steep. You pay 10 or 15% interest rates if you are a double B borrower, sub-investment grade, compared to what a triple A or double A minus borrower pays. And why is that? Long story, and I won't go into it, but making that flatter so that for poor countries they have access to low-cost capital is crucial. One way to do that is larger multilateral development banks. This is, everybody agrees on that, though they don't agree to do it, but they agree that that's one part of the solution. More ADB, more AIIB, more new development bank, more World Bank. That requires capital increases. Capital increases mean larger voting shares for China. The United States needs to swallow, and Europe needs to swallow and get on with it. So that's one part of what needs to be done. The second part is to de-risk private capital flows. That's also a tricky set of issues. I'd say I got into that question 45 years ago as a graduate student, and it's still somewhat of a puzzle. It's a long story, but it's not impossible to do that. There's one more dimension, and because also you're from the Russian Federation, I want to mention it, and that is that there's an intrinsic link between global finance and global monetary arrangements. And global monetary arrangements mean how we settle trade. And we are, of course, in a largely dollar-based settlements system. So the monetary system is largely dollar-based, not exclusively, but about 60%. And the United States, unfortunately and unwisely, weaponized the dollar-based payment system starting about 15 years ago by seizing assets, including Russian assets recently, the $300 billion seized in 2022, but also Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and a number of others. To my mind, this is a completely unacceptable and self-defeating policy. It's cheap because the President of the United States can do it with a stroke of the pen. You don't have to ask Congress, you don't have to ask the public, you don't have to ask the UN, you don't have to ask anybody. To my mind, it's blatantly illegal and absolutely practically unwise. Because why would you use dollars if the US is going to take them away from you when they don't like what you're doing? The idea of payments is that they're reliable, not that they're political. So this is why the BRICS countries, especially under Russia's leadership this year, are negotiating non-dollar payments. And I support this entirely. But I also say to the US Treasury all the time, don't confiscate other people's money. It's not a good policy. It's not going to work. And the idea, by the way, of grabbing Russia's $300 billion for Ukraine is so illegal you don't even know where to start. But these are politicians. They're not lawyers. They're not diplomats. They're not financiers. They want quick solutions for their re-elections. So this is really a problem. But it's a problem that also has a solution because we just won't use the dollar in places where the United States policies could lead to confiscation. So all of this means we have a bit of a morass in the international financial system within our family of getting the right answers to the financing questions. There's actually one more technical point I need to mention, which is that the IMF and the World Bank have what they call the Debt Sustainability Framework, or DSF. And it's based on an arbitrary set of numbers where they say, we grade you whether you're weak, medium, or strong in debt management. And then based on your ranking, we give you a ceiling of gross debt to GDP. And the ceiling is no more than 30% debt to GDP ratio if you are a weakly governed country. This is a death certificate. This is not economic policy. Why? Because if you're a poor country, it means almost by definition you don't have electricity, you don't have paved roads, you don't have digital access, and your kids aren't in school. So what the IMF and the World Bank are telling you is, stay that way. Don't bother us. Don't borrow because you might get into debt trouble. But if you don't borrow, you won't have electricity, schools, or anything else. They don't have an alternative solution for these countries. So they're telling the countries, don't borrow. I'm telling the countries, borrow. But my advice is borrow 30-year maturity, fixed interest rates, and on reasonable terms. But where do you get those? That's where I want the G20 to come into this story, to give an answer to that. But when I do, again, in my spare time, solving a growth model for how much you should borrow if you want to have your kids in school, have electricity and so on, exactly your question, the debt actually rises to about 200% of GDP before it starts declining 30 years from now. You want to borrow a lot because you don't want to live without electricity, you don't want to live without roads, you don't want to live without educated children, you don't want to live without health facilities. So you want to borrow, but you want the borrowing to be very long term so that you have 40 years to grow in order to repay the debt 40 years from now. The IMF has none of this intertemporal analysis because the debt sustainability framework is a 5-year snapshot. It's not a growth scenario. Now, I taught intertemporal growth for 30 years, and this is where I tell my students, you learn something, right? You borrow if the rate of return on your investment is higher than the cost of capital, and if you're not going to get into a debt crisis in the meantime. So we need to create a finance framework that can work. Final words. For this region, SCAP, there are a few countries that are seriously debt constrained or finance constrained. Most are not, but some are. For Africa, it's pervasive. The whole continent is debt constrained right now. So that's where the most serious problems are. Within this region, you have the means to solve the problem because this is a high saving region. And China has a saving surplus. That's why initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative are wonderful. And they should really be encouraged. But the advice I give to China is when you lend for the Belt and Road Initiative, lend for 30 years. Don't lend for 10 years or 12 years. You will be disappointed and your counterpart will be very disappointed because they'll get into debt crisis. And that's what's happening right now. Not that China set a debt trap, that's propaganda. China didn't set a debt trap, it just set a maturity structure too short. And so when I speak to the Chinese finance authorities, I'm telling them 30-year loans. And nobody thinks ahead more than China. So China needs to do the same thing of looking at a 30-year perspective, and especially for the poorer countries, give much longer term loans. And for the rest of the US, unfortunately, is not a net savings surplus country, it's a net debtor country, so it can't offer much in finance anymore. But the capital markets could offer more, and we need to tap that. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but good, very good question, important question.
President Lula has named Dilma Rousseff as the head of the BRICS Bank. Its importance in terms of this multipolarity in the world economies, the potential for even the creation of alternative major currencies to the dollar as a result of the BRICS alliance, the impact of that on world affairs.
This is a big deal. And in fact, the United States is withdrawing. It doesn't know it necessarily. Our politicians don't understand this, but our politicians are withdrawing from the world financial and monetary scene and opening up the space for a completely different kind of international finance. I'll give you an example. The U.S. was the creator of the World Bank, but now the U.S. Congress won't put new money into the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank's actually a quite small institution. It's got a big name, but it's a quite small institution in the financial scheme of things. The U.S. won't put more money in. The Congress says, no, why should we waste our money internationally and so forth? And you get a lot of hubbub about that. So China and the rest of the BRICS say, okay, we'll make our own development bank. And they established the new development bank, or sometimes called the BRICS Bank, based in Shanghai. And that's just one of the institutions that is really changing the scene. There's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, based in Beijing, in fact. There is, as President Lula said, and it's happening also in the context of the Ukraine war, a move away from the use of the dollar, which the United States has thought, well, that's our ace in the hole. You know, that is our ultimate hold on things because we can use sanctions, we can use our financial control to keep other countries in line. But other countries are saying, not so much. We'll trade in renminbi. We'll trade in rubles. We'll trade in rupees. We'll trade in our own national currencies. And they're quickly setting up alternative institutions to do this. The United States doubles down. We will confiscate your reserves. We will, if you don't follow. And the other countries are saying, you know, if you want to go through the UN and get really multilateral rules, we're with you. But if you want to just impose the rules, we won't follow along. And so we have this very funny expression called a rule-based international order. The United States government uses it every day. But what does it mean? Who writes the rules? And what most of the world wants, in fact, is rules written in a multipolar or multilateral setting, not rules written by the United States and a few friends and allies.
I wanted to ask you, you've been an advisor to the United Nations for quite often. The issue of how much longer the permanent members of the Security Council can keep the number to 5, because clearly Brazil and other countries of the global south have been saying the UN needs to be reformed. And countries from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Africa, should have representation on the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Yes, you know, the P5, the permanent 5, which is the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, was the World War II victor group in 1945. They wrote into the rules of the UN, incidentally, that they would be the permanent Security Council members and have a veto over any change in the UN Charter. So it's really a group that gave itself power that the other 188 countries of the world look on and say, what is this? We need change. I would say the country that is most amazed and frustrated by this, in fact, is India. India is now the most populous country in the world. The United States has 335 million, roughly, in the population. Britain, France, roughly 60 million. India, 1.4 billion, not on the Security Council, a nuclear power, a world superpower, the president of the G20 this year, really not happy about that. Brazil, the largest economy of South America, similarly not on the Security Council. So this has been an issue for more than 20 years. The P5 in various ways have blocked particular countries, but added up, the P5 have said, you know what, this is our club. We want to stay as the permanent 5. But I think as we really face the reality of it's not just a post-US dominated world, but actually a post-Western dominated world, because it was the US as the dominant power among the so-called West, which means the US, Britain, European Union, and honorary Western membership, Japan, let's say. But we're post-Western as well as post-US in dominance. And these international institutions will need to change, or they won't function in the 21st century. And if they don't function, it's actually a disaster for us. If they didn't exist, we'd have to make them because we need them to function. So we also need to renovate them.
I wanted to talk about China negotiating these various agreements. Let's turn to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, speaking before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
O que o Putin quer? O Putin não pode ficar com terreno.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but he will have to rethink what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't have everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border, so this is something we have to put on the table.
Eu acho que essa guerra já passou da conta. O Brasil já fez a crítica que tinha que fazer.
I think this war has dragged on for too long. Brazil has already criticized what it had to criticize. Brazil defends each nation's territorial integrity, so we disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of a major counteroffensive against Russia. And in order to do this, needs massive support from Western countries, meaning military weapons. Can you talk about what China's role is here, the peace plan it has put forward, but also these other deals that China is helping to negotiate, like the successful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then what they're suggesting about Israel and Palestine?
President Lula uttered in a few words the core of this issue that most of our media dare not explain to the American people, and that is the expansion of NATO. This is a war fundamentally about the U.S. attempt to expand a U.S. military alliance to Ukraine and to Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus, also on the Black Sea. The U.S. strategy, going back decades, has been to surround Russia in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all NATO members surrounding Russia and its naval fleet in the Black Sea, with a naval fleet that has been the Black Sea naval fleet of Russia since 1783. Russia has said, this is our red line, and it has said that for decades. And it said this clearly in 2007, before George W. Bush Jr. had I'll call it the harebrained idea to announce in 2008 and force NATO to announce that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And this is what President Lula was saying, and what President Xi Jinping of China has been saying. We can't have a war that is essentially a proxy war between Russia and the United States over the expansion of the U.S. military alliance right up to a 1,200-kilometer and more border with Russia, which Russia views, and I would say understandably views, as a fundamental national security threat to Russia. Keep some space, keep some distance. That's President Lula's meaning. That's what China means when it says in its peace plan, we want a peace plan that respects the security interests of all parties. What that is code word for saying, make peace, end the war, but don't expand NATO right up to the border. The American people have not heard an explanation of this all along. It's shocking to me because as a close observer of this for 30 years, this has been the casus belli. And yet our newspapers won't even report the background to this. But this is why China, South Africa, India, Brazil are saying we want peace, but we don't want NATO expansion as the meaning of so-called peace. We want the big superpowers to give each other some space and some distance so that the world isn't on a knife edge. That's exactly what President Lula was saying, and it's exactly what the meaning of the Chinese peace initiative is to say, yes, absolutely make peace, protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its security, but no to NATO expansion. But the Biden administration won't even discuss this issue. That has been the major failing and the reason why we have not been able to get to the negotiating table, in my opinion. Even when Zelensky said in March 2022, maybe not NATO, maybe something else, Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement, and the United States intervened with Ukraine and said, we don't think that's a good agreement, because the U.S. neocons, so-called, have been pushing for NATO enlargement as the core of this issue. But this goes back to the more general point for us, which is that what is at stake in Ukraine and over Taiwan and many other issues from the point of view of China or Russia or other countries, including Brazil, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, is whether the U.S. does what it wants to do or whether the U.S. respects some limits based on what other countries say, well, this is what we think, so that we need true multipolarity, not U.S. dominance alone. Rules written by all of us, not rules written just by the United States.
And Jeff Sachs, we only have a few, about a minute left, but I was wondering if you could comment on the parallels between this expansion of NATO further and further east in Europe. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, of President Monroe declaring to all the European powers that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to them attempting to move their forces and their militaries into Latin America. And for these past 200 years, Latin America has essentially been the major sphere of influence of the United States. And yet here we are saying that Russia has no right to declare that its immediate the countries in immediately its borders cannot welcome in NATO troops.
Well, yes, a little empathy would go a long way and would have spared us actually a lot of wars. But for Americans, it would be useful to think, suppose Mexico made a military alliance with China. Would the United States say, well, that's Mexico's right, what are we going to do about it? Or might there be actually an invasion in short order or something like that? I would strongly advise to China and Mexico, don't try it at home. Don't experiment with this. But the United States government refuses that empathy because, in other words, refuses to put itself in the position of the other side. That's the fundamental arrogance of thinking that you determine the rules of the world. The problem with arrogance is not only the comeuppance from it, but you stumble into terrible crises that you don't even understand because the United States has not been allowed, the public has not been allowed to even think from the perspective of the other side. So the analogy is actually a very, very clear analogy. It is what China and Russia and others say all the time is, why have those double standards? Why don't we actually deal with each other with mutual respect, not with the rules that you write?
Then, if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening, repeated mantra of the U.S. government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then. It started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the U.S. poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, have been part of this story since 2014. And really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well, because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Nuland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the U.S. pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Nuland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days,
and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the US government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that and said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliance is? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you know, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and yeah, NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, and you know, then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is
Yeah.
that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game?
Yeah,
It was a
yeah.
board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing could stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower, and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads. And they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me. But the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, because Smith is writing in 1776, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, hereafter, perhaps the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Chinggis Khan, it was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them, this is a limit, and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now. But it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet. But this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era. And the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths, again, using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track. Nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost.
John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read, because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was, what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb, and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. And that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year, and I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon. We are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think
finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now, because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it, because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.
I think it really strengthens the weaknesses of carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutralization by 2050. But I feel like the United States haven't done enough of, promoting this ideology of, carbon neutrality. So how, as citizens ourselves, can, push for those changes?
It's interesting. In the United States, most people know that climate change is a very serious crisis, and we just had the devastating fires in Hawaii to show how tragic this climate change is. We're in the hottest period in not only recorded history, but in human history for the last 125,000 years. The month of July was probably the single hottest month ever that humanity has experienced. Certainly that's true during the period of recorded temperatures. So we should be doing much more. And the American people know this. And certain things are happening, of course. There's investment in green energy in a lot of places. There's investment in the conversion of the auto industry to electric vehicles, which is part of the solution. But at the national level, there was a piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very strange name for legislation which is mainly centered on the energy transformation, and it gives tax breaks for green energy. But what it doesn't do is make a national plan. There is no national plan. It doesn't make a national plan because in American politics, the power of the fossil fuel lobby, big oil and big coal, is so strong that politicians don't tell the truth to their own constituents, and they act on behalf of their lobbies who pay for their campaigns rather than on behalf of the American people. In the United States Senate, in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the chairman, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is notorious for being the front for the big oil lobby. And he himself has family wealth tied up in 2 coal companies. So I regard that as corruption, but in the American system, it's legal corruption, or seems to be legal, but it's corruption nonetheless. If you're told that in a country that hasn't taken a clear plan for decarbonization, has senior officials who own coal companies, you'd say, well, of course, that's just political corruption. But unfortunately, that's how the United States works. So the American people are saying more and more, we're disgusted with the political system. It's all about money. It's all about the reelection of these corrupt politicians. And
Right.
I think that the more we clarify how broken this is, the farther we're going to get. But of course, at substantive levels, we need a plan of action to decarbonize by 2050 that is not only at the state level, because many states have such plans taking shape, but at the federal level. And one of the main lessons of what's happening right now is that there are more projects in more projects in wind and solar
Yep.
than can be put onto the grid, because the real breakdown is the transmission system. But that's where federal investment and a federal plan is needed. And we don't have that because of all the political problems that I talked about.
And I think that America's structure is so like money based, money focused, that it comes before the mutual benefits that all the human can get. It's
That's
always
exactly right.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's not based on the common good. It's based on the special interest.
Right, it's always money, money, money. And then I want to touch on this is that we all know that Japanese is going to have a nuclear wastewater dumps. So what are some actions that United Nations would do to counter this type of behavior?
Well, on the specifics on Japan, I can't really comment because I haven't studied the scientific arguments on both sides. And in general, on technical arguments, I tend to listen to the range of experts and ask their opinion. So I would think at a minimum what the UN should be doing, and maybe it is, and I'm just not involved at all in it, is looking at through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna, at this question of the wastewater from Fukushima and what should be done about it, because that's a technical issue that should not be any individual government's authority. The UN should weigh in, especially at the technical level. But in general, we have some pretty clear needs that are urgent, whether it's the decarbonization or protecting the ecosystems from pollution or from over harvesting or from waste. And we need technical plans of action. But that planning mechanism is hard work. And it's hard work for the political reason of keeping it free from corruption. And it's hard work at the technical level because a lot of technical issues are raised. And so countries need effective planning ministries. China has the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, which does a lot of the technical planning. And the United States doesn't have a planning ministry. So we don't make plans because we don't have a ministry of planning or a ministry of economy or a planning agency. In the US lexicon, planning is a bad idea. But, you know, for certain things, I am happy that planning is done within private businesses, but for other things, I want the planning to be done by government. And in every sphere of the economy, planning is essential. It's just that sometimes it's not a government function, sometimes it's a private sector function.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the United States government needs to go through a really big structural change. And in that, I think the driving forces are the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people coming up. But right now, I think we lack guidance. So what are some advices that you would guide, like some advices that you would give us to start with?
Well, that's a really very interesting and deep question, because let me just say that our Constitution was drafted in 1787. Of course, it's had some amendments since then, but basically it's the same structure that was decided in 1787. And it's out of date. It doesn't have the substantive principles that are needed for the modern period, and it does not enable the strong planning or environmental protection or assurance of economic rights for the people. So it's really an out-of-date structure in many, many ways. At the same time, it has been deeply damaged by corruption, by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the U.S. system, because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And yeah, I think currently another problem with the U.S. is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. Like the counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States.
So, excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States, because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually. And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University working together, discussing and so forth, somehow making such projects, both economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low-cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world.